I know of moms who have gone with their kids to buy drugs from their drug dealers in the darkest alleys, the most dangerous places, because they claim that their drug dealers are going to kill them if they don't give them the money. This is not just, I'm sitting home worrying about my child. If we're not careful and we are tethered to these life-destructive behaviors and choices that they are making, we are putting ourselves, our family, in danger as well.
Welcome to the Juggling Life Finding Balance podcast. I'm your host, Vivian Cummins. This has been a fabulous season so far. My guest and I have been having great conversations about balance in our relationships. And today's topic is one that I believe is affecting so many parents today, and maybe it's affecting you too. And that is coping with the painful reality that your child is spiraling out of control due to addiction or self-destructive behaviors. My guest today is Dawn Ward, and she knows all too well the devastation that addiction brings to a family because she's lived it. After years of trying to break free from feelings of guilt, shame, and self-blame, she finally surrendered her will for God's. Dawn Ward is a speaker, writer, and biblical life coach. She is the founder of the Faith to Flourish Ministry and the author of the book From Guilt to Grace: Hope and Healing for Christian Moms of Addicted Children. We're going to talk all about her book today and so much more. But before we do that, one last thing. Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast wherever you are listening or watching so that we can continue to spread the word. Now let's dive in with my guest, Dawn Ward. Well, welcome, Dawn. Thank you so much for joining me for the Juggling Life Finding Balance podcast. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Vivian.
Thank you for being here. You know, today's topic is one that I believe so many parents, especially mothers, are facing, and that is coping with the painful reality that their adult children are addicted or in some type of self-destructive behavior. And Dawn, you actually wrote a book about this very thing because you've experienced it with your own children. And I mentioned it in the introduction, but the book is titled From Guilt to Grace: Hope and Healing for the Christian Moms of Addicted Children. So if you would, could you set the scene for what led you to become an expert in this area, and how did your journey begin?
That is a loaded question, but thank you for asking. You know, an expert, what mom wants to sign up to be an expert in the field of addiction, especially when it is concerning her children? Like, none of us want that. As I look back, though, on my life, I do realize that the Lord had his hand upon me, because when I growing up in my family, my father struggled with excessive drinking. So when I was a little girl, I know I was under 5 years of age because of the house we lived in. I felt the Lord grab onto my hand. And at the time, I wasn't really raised in a Christian home. My mother had taken us to the Lutheran church on the holidays and things, but I knew it was the Lord. I knew it was God. And he said, hold on to my hand and never let go, because you're going to need me for this life.
Oh, wow.
Then when I became 11 or 12, somewhere around there, I think I was at maybe I think it was a Billy Graham youth crusade type thing. And they tell you what born again is, right?
Yes.
Everybody runs down to receive Jesus. So that's when I made a public testimony. So by the time I got married, and we waited about 6.5, almost 7 years to have children, I was determined that they were not going to grow up and be these, drinkers and be alcoholics. So the thought of drugs didn't cross my mind. And I'm careful to say alcoholic or addict, because I know in society we try not to label people, but for lack of better terms, someone's who either addicted to substances or addicted to alcohol. Mm-hmm. And so I was really working hard to educate my children, to vet their friends, to make sure that they went to Christian school, to church, trying to educate them based on my knowledge, but it was very fear-based. And I didn't drink at all because I didn't want to have that in possibly something that would be passed down through environment, that my children would see their parents doing this. I mean, I was very fear driven, that I did not want my kids to turn out like, even though my dad was kind of the loud, boisterous, he never hit me or beat me or anything, but he just was loud and scary and derogative. But I didn't even like the way my uncles behaved when they were stumbling and falling around and stuff. Neither one of them was very pretty. And so I was trying to warn my kids, because this could definitely destroy your life. And I just didn't understand that there was a possibility that they would ever go out and actually try drugs. and that would be what they would be exposed to. Now, I knew plenty of people who were hippies and smoked pot when I was growing up. And, there were people that were doing cocaine and different drugs back then and things. But I didn't really know anybody who was actually what they would have called an addict back then, that they would have said was an addict or a junkie or those kind of terms, which, are very derogative. But I didn't know those people. And the first situation I had was with my middle son, my younger son. I have two boys and a girl.
Mhm.
And they had all been in Christian school, but my husband had had a car accident. He'd had multiple surgeries and he was disabled, and I had gone back to work full time. And so we also didn't have the money to keep them in the private school, and we'd transferred them to public school. And for him, it just seemed to hit him harder. He got involved in sports and he got involved in the band and music and everything. He was really doing great. My oldest son had already graduated from high school, was in college. And it was that last year of high school that things seemed to go a little, go wrong for him. And it wasn't anything I expected, because he was just this really good kid. He seemed to always pick really good friends, and he was always honest. But I noticed some changes. He has beautiful red hair. His hair went black. He dyed it black. One day I caught him at where I went to the store that he worked at just to go get some to go get some clothes. It was Target. And I saw him out front smoking. And so there were things that I started seeing, and I'm like, oh my gosh, my kid is smoking, and then he looked kind of goth, and then his grades started slipping. And so this was all kind of that first quarter, into the second quarter of his senior year. And this was a straight A student, that was on the football team, decided he didn't want to play football. And these kind of things were starting to happen. And I would get in his face and say, what's going on with you? What are you doing? And what's wrong with your eyes? Why are they red? And I would ask these things. But back then I didn't know you could go get a drug test. I was just very naive. It wasn't anything I'd even been exposed to. I thought you'd have to take him to the emergency room and have the doctors check him. And
Mhm.
and then when I did find out about drug tests, they were super expensive, and you had to know which drugs you were testing for. And so it was just one of those situations where I just didn't think it was really something that serious. One day he came to he came to his dad and said, I got in with the wrong crowd. I thought that I was smoking marijuana, but for some reason I can't stop it. Every time I try to stop it, I'm getting sick and I feel really bad. And my friend's going through this too, and we both want to get help. And so without even knowing what was in there and the addictive substances that this drug was laced with, we had to take him, we got him to the doctor, we got urine tests, got things done to see what was going on. And indeed, there were addictive substances in there. And I really caution parents to be very aware of that, because, drugs like marijuana and stuff are legal in a lot of states. And not everybody goes into the dispensary to get these drugs. And, and they could end up being exposed to very dangerous drugs, especially things like fentanyl that are on the streets right now that are highly lethal. In our case, there was, I think there was some cocaine in there. I think there was some black tar heroin in there. There was some very addictive things. Now, the doctors did explain that what he was on back then was organic and natural, and his body could just feel like garbage for a few days and could get off of it. And it would, they'd help us with that process. But the main thing would be he'd have to get away from his friends that are still thinking this stuff is okay, and intense outpatient counseling, those type of things, just to help him understand and learn how to work through some of the emotions and things and some of the temptations. Well, I wish it was all that easy, but of course, like you said, he's a minor. He's under 18. Yeah. He still thinks that he's in charge of his world, and just, get him off these things and he can go back out and do what he wants again. So he did have an episode where he relapsed again. He turned 18 and he was like, I need to get out of this town. Like, I need to get away from my friends. And I had basically said, you can go. You can't live here and do this stuff. So I think he was probably couch surfing for a few weeks. It helped him to kind of come to his senses. And so that's what we did. We moved him out of state. He actually went into a Christian program, but more the second phase, where he was taking classes and learning how to become a mental health coach and a addiction counselor. And he was in that really positive environment that he ended up working in that environment for a few years before he went back to college. And so changing environment was a really good thing for him. In that case, we kind of felt like we had, dodged a bullet. We were all doing pretty good. And then what happened was my older son, come to find out, had a congenital birth defect. But this happened to be during that time when Big Pharma was putting out drugs like Percocet, Oxycontin, drugs like
Right.
that, and saying that they
Mhm.
weren't addictive. They
Mhm.
were called, if you did feel like you could develop a dependency, they said it was a pseudo addiction, which all that meant was that you had built up a tolerance and now
Mhm.
you needed to take more.
More.
But
Yeah.
taking more just escalated to more problems. And so for him, having some other struggles with some depression and anxiety, that combination, along with now having these very strong pain medications, led to him getting pulled into a dependency very quickly.
Oh.
And I remember taking him to our family doctor and saying, "What's going on? He can't get off these medications that he was given by these surgeons a few months ago." And she's like, "I'm sorry, but the medical professionals have failed you. Your son is addicted to this." So now all of a sudden we're looking at medical reasons why somebody became addicted versus, hey, I hung out with the wrong crowd. Then I became like the mom who really is going through all the things that you read about and those
Yes.
calls and those middle of the night phone calls from jail and, oh, well, at least he's not
Oh,
dead and the car's been
Dawn.
totaled and those type of things and the breakdowns and a few times some suicide attempts and things. And so we went through a much darker period, took him lower. I really do admire people who have gotten into this position and are trying so hard to get out and are fighting with everything that they have to not succumb to the temptation to go back to it again, and just how it continues to spiral downward, because it's a very hard battle for them. And I haven't been in that place, but the actual situation, having gone through it with, looking back at my dad and the men in his life, my brother who struggled with morbid obesity, my children, and then about the same time that my son became addicted to pain meds, my husband did also. My brother, my uncles, my dad, my grandfather, all of them in one form or another have struggled with addiction.
Wow. Dawn, my goodness, that definitely does make you an expert in this area, and I'm sorry you had to go through all of that, but God knew,
Yes.
and I believe He equipped you even back then to be able to handle it, and you're so strong. You know, in your book, you talk about the blame game, and I would love for you to take a minute and kind of tell us more about that, because I think a lot of times as parents, we tend to blame ourselves for our children's actions and behaviors. So tell us a little bit more about the blame game, and where does God and faith fit into all of that?
The blame game is just how I've lived my life, because even as a kid, everyone was pointing each fingers at each other. Like the kids never want to get in trouble, so they point the fingers at each other. And even if my mother said, "Who broke that glass?" I don't know. And maybe she did, maybe she did. So it's something that I think is human nature, to
Mhm.
not take personal responsibility, maybe for fear of the consequences. When it comes to addiction, especially with the moms, and the reason I can speak of having experience with moms is because God did have me start a ministry to women, and the group has about 4,000 women in it. So I've learned, and I've had a lot of opportunity to just listen and hear the hearts of moms and hear what they are going through. Fathers, for the most part, now it's not all fathers, but for the most part, men tend to be able to kind of compartmentalize that a little bit more. They tend to not, whose fault is it? They want to go in and figure out how to fix it
Fix it.
rather than whose fault is it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. We tend to say as moms, like, why did this happen? What could I have done differently? Why didn't I see this coming? I should have been paying attention when this, that, or the other happened back when. I didn't realize this was hurting my child so much and I didn't see this coming. Or, that dumb ex-husband of mine who's never around, that bum, he's not, he should be more influential in his children's life. Or in my case, was it my bad genes? Was there something in my genes that did this, that made this happen to my children? Or that's that social media that they're all on and all those dark video games they're getting involved in. Or if there's any number of reasons why we can search for an answer to why something happens. And I think that we'll probably never get an answer that satisfies us anyway. So even if we had that answer, we could say there's this one specific situation that happened. It To stay there in that situation and keep focusing on it doesn't allow you to move forward and
Right.
say, okay, what can I do moving forward to help my son or daughter that are going through this? And if we're constantly casting blame and we're constantly going through that conversation all the time, we are really going to stay stuck. And we're going to probably stay stuck in bitterness, unforgiveness, either towards ourselves or someone else. Shame really comes along with the blame game. And that doesn't mean that we can't look and see who might have contributed. We know that there's a lot going on. And, I don't even really like to get into politics. My ministry doesn't really get into politics and all that, but there's a lot of things we could say about what's wrong with the broken system that's allowing the amount of drugs that are coming into our country to be coming in and all of that. There's a lot of
Yeah.
things that we could, and advocacy is a good thing. And if someone as a mother is called to advocacy and to get involved with the legislature and to speak out and to go to schools perhaps and educate children and all of that, we should do that. That's a productive way to say, look, I see a flaw in this system here and I want to do something about it.
Yeah.
But asking a question about who is to blame and why it happened, and then doing nothing with it but ruminating over it and getting angrier and angrier and not moving forward, that's where I would caution us to be careful with that.
Oh, that's really good. Thank you for
Mhm.
sharing. I forgot to show this book in the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and put it on camera now so that folks can. I've got tabs, folks. This is such a great book. Um, but I wanted to ask you in chapter 6, I found this really interesting. You talk about false anchors, idols, and codependency. And you say that as moms of wayward children,
Yeah.
we will do just about anything to help them. And while they're anchoring themselves to the self destructive behaviors and habits, we anchor ourselves to them in an effort to try to save them. So, can
Yes.
you explain to us what is that false anchor and how is it related to idolatry and codependency? I found that to be so interesting.
Isn't that? Yeah, that is a tough one. When I first started trying to figure this out, what happened was I would continually go to meetings and I would come leaving so depressed, like, oh
Mm,
my gosh, there's no hope here. I'd hear the statistics and I'd be like, oh, this is a death sentence. And I had no hope at all. And what happened was, if your child wandered out in the middle of the street, you wouldn't care if there was traffic. You wouldn't think at all. You would just run out there to grab that child and bring them back in and get them to safety. That starts to happen when you're always panicking and you're always in
mm,
flight or fight. You're not thinking consciously about the decisions you're making. You're just literally tethered to their action. So whatever action they do, it's a natural response for the mom to just follow and try to save them from whatever that is. And God, why is this happening? Why, if I say that I trust you and I say you're Lord of my life, every time the phone rings, every time I get a text message, every time I get a knock at the door, every time my kid calls with some story, panicking and needing money or needing me to come and get them out of whatever trouble they're in, I just run and do it without stopping and thinking about it. And sometimes they're taking us out into very dangerous waters. I know of
mhm.
moms who have gone with their kids to buy drugs from their drug dealers in the darkest alleys and
Oh my
most
goodness.
dangerous places because they claim that their drug dealers are going to kill them if they don't give them the money. And the mother's going and doing it to make sure that the money gets to their hands. I know
Wow.
people right now who are cash apping money to drug dealers. Okay, so when I talk about this, I'm saying this is not just I'm sitting home worrying about my child. If we're not careful and we are tethered to these life destructive behaviors and choices that they are making, we are putting ourselves, our family in danger as well. And I had to start to make decisions like that. Like, God, are you really God of my life? Do I really trust you if that rope, that anchor
Mm,
between me and my son can't hold anymore because I'm not strong enough? I'm not
mm.
strong enough to anchor myself to him and to his behaviors and go the places with him that he goes and still get up every morning and go to work and take care of the rest of my family. This is taking me lower and lower and lower. In the book, I describe a time when I lose an anchor and it's, not tethered to the boat and it just drops to the bottom and I can't see it down there. And God used that example for me to realize that's what's going to happen if you tether yourself to these life destructive behaviors and choices, even though you love your child and want to help them. And so that's where codependency, the Bible doesn't use the word codependency. That's more of a psychological term that they use. And it really is just about us being so intermeshed with this person and their happiness and their well being and all of this that we give up on our own. We
Mhm.
are no longer, we're no longer a separate person. We are blended into their identity, into their behavior and everything. And that's a codependent behavior, is when we're not making decisions at all based anymore on what's best for us. It's only what we think will make the other person happy. And so idolatry is actually the reason why I wrote the book. When I initially started studying boundaries, I realized that God has so much to say about boundaries. And he often calls them in the Bible cords, or he calls them bands, cords of love, bands of kindness. And I realized that God allowed his children to go through really hard, really rough things. Yes, the cord would only go so far. The band would only go so far. That was his loving arm. That was his grace saying, his children would wander and they would get themselves involved in the worst things, children of Israel. And then they would wander away. And then his loving kindness would bring them back. And he was consistent with this, even though they were rebellious and their hearts were always going after idols. What were those idols? They were the things that these other countries that were not worshiping the one true God, whatever it was, whether it was a golden calf or sexual promiscuity or whatever the things were that they were doing in this idolatry, these things that are common to what we do when we chase after these things that are not good for us but bring us pleasure. And so as I studied it, I realized that God has a lot to say about our hearts. And but he also shows us how faithful his love is. And so I started writing a Bible study called Faithful: God's Relentless Love for Wandering Hearts. And it was really based on the book of Hosea, and just God's, how he sees us as his children, his love for us, that we can never go too far. We can never wander away so far that the love of God cannot reach us and bring us back. But we have a tendency to say, God, especially for those of us who are moms that call her, that are believers and love Jesus and everything. And we say, Jesus, I love you. You are Lord of my life. You are sitting on the throne of my life. But I had to have that day when I realized he wasn't. Yes, was he
Mm.
God? Was he always going to be on the throne?
Right.
Absolutely. But in my heart, I had put my child above God. And I had kind of relegated God to the driver's seat. I mean, the passenger seat. And I was like,
Mhm.
Lord, I want
Mhm.
you to come along. I want you to do A, B, and C for my child, but mama knows best.
Yeah.
And so that was when it really was about him looking at my heart and saying, do you love me enough to trust me? Do you believe what I've written in this word, that I love your child? I love you. My eye is upon them. I am doing everything I can to bring them back to me. I do not want your child out there self-destructing. I don't want them on a path that's going to lead them to regret.
Mhm.
If they don't
Mhm.
know the Lord as their personal savior, that could even lead them to hell. I
Right.
don't I don't want that for them, because I want all men to come to me. I want everyone to be saved, including your children. So my love, my grace, my mercy can travel wherever they're at. So as a mom, I had to say, okay, what does that look like? What does it look like to let go, right? And that's the whole anchor dilemma of actually allowing myself to not be tethered to my son's choices anymore.
Oh, that is such a great explanation. The whole idolatry thing, I don't think we think about it that way. And you look in your life, what are those things that we are holding above God, right? And it tends to usually be our children, our spouse, maybe even our career. And so I think, I mean, that's such a great concept that you've got there about your addicted child. But I think that can go with pretty much anything in life as well. So that's a great chapter. I really enjoyed that chapter. You brought up the word boundaries, which I don't think you can have a discussion about addicted family members without talking about boundaries. But oftentimes, when we set those boundaries, it can feel like abandonment, right? And so, what is a mother to do? I mean, if you were to set up, you talked about some of these mothers that are going into the darkest alleys with their children. What if they set up that boundary and said, I'm not going to do that? Well, then now what?
Yes, that's exactly it. Now what? When I made the decision that, and just a little bit of a backtrack, is my aha moment came, and I share this often, but it reminds me that I recognize God's voice in the midst of turmoil, just like I did when I was 4 or 5 years old. And it was I was at the point where my mind, even though I worked full time, I was functioning by all outward appearances, got up every morning, put my makeup on and everything. My brain was starting to break. And I could hear in my mind, like actually hear, and I understand, I have empathy now for people who have psychosis and things, because I could hear it saying, you have to fix your son, you have to fix your son, you have to fix your son. It never stopped. If I woke up, it was there. If I went to bed, it was there. And I could have this conversation with you, and on this very quiet, like music playing in a restaurant, I would hear that going on in my brain. And so I was desperate. I was researching everything, trying to find answers, because I understood there was mental health issues along with the addiction. And so it was very complicated. And my husband said to me one day, honey, this was before this was before he got into gambling and everything. I was trying to think of the timetable. So it was a little bit before that. So probably about 10 years ago, I heard God say to me, no, first of all, my husband said, you're going to worry yourself to death. And I said, you're right. You can put that on my tombstone. She worried herself to death. And I actually pictured this old gray tombstone, cobwebs and everything, and said, she worried herself to death. But then I felt God do it again. I felt Jesus tap on my shoulder and say, no, I wanted to say she trusted God. So he gave me that same challenge. And when he said it to me, I remembered, hold on to my hand and don't let go. You're going to need me. So the same way he was now challenging me. And I thought, you're right. That has to be my legacy. If this is my life, if my son never changes, ultimately I made that decision many times moving forward. If my husband never changes, if, my daughter's on the autism spectrum, if things don't go great for her, like all these things, if, instead of saying why or how come, and if we say, why did that happen? Instead, even if the worst thing happens, I'm going to trust you. Well, what does that look like? What does trust look like? And for me, I remember saying, I have to really figure out how to get my own head on straight. Like, Lord, I'm seeing that you're doing this in me. You're empowering me. You're putting the desire in me to change. What does that look like? And so the effort that I was putting into fixing my son, I started putting into doing the things to make me, feel better and get better. And so that would be things like, sometimes for a mom, it's not even normal to spend $20 to get herself some, new sunglasses, or to go get a manicure, or simple little self-care things, go to the dentist and get her teeth cleaned. Those things will feel, if you're that enmeshed in codependency, you will feel guilty, because that money you could put on, say, if your child's incarcerated, on their books at the jail so that they could buy some Slim Jims or get some food or something. And because I've been there, that's why I use that example.
Slim Jims.
Yeah. And so for some moms, or their kids are hounding them for cigarettes. They want the cigarettes because they're in jail, and they're saying, Mom, I want that. And the mother will take and do that money, or she will use money that she was going to use for one of the little one's sports to take care of big brother who's going through this. So I had to start to say, how does it look to be, what's the collateral damage going on with my family here? What's the collateral damage in my own life? And it feels a little selfish when you first start putting boundaries that are very healthy boundaries up. It can feel so selfish. You can feel like, I'm just the most meanest mom in the whole wide world. But I was going to quote here the famous Dr. Henry Cloud and John Townsend. Those men wrote the first book, Boundaries, years ago. And they know their stuff. And what they say is, boundaries are anything that helps to differentiate you from someone else, or shows where you begin and end. And when a mom has a newborn baby, she puts everything into that baby. And she doesn't mind if she loses her sleep. She doesn't, because that baby is helpless. And you should be helping that little baby, because that baby depends on you. That's an interdependent relationship where mom takes care of the mom gives 100%, 150%, and baby just takes. But then as baby gets older and learns some of their own skills in life, and they learn how to tie their own shoes, and they learn how to, put their dishes in the dishwasher, and they learn these type of things, you shouldn't continue to do those things for them. Well, what happens with addiction is it comes to a halt. And for whatever reason, we don't only just look at our kid as, say, the 17-year-old who started using drugs, or the 25-year-old who started using drugs. We go back to what it felt like when they were little kids. And we think that we need to act that way with them. And so a lot of boundaries is treating people with respect and treating them as adults, even if they're not behaving like it. Okay. And so another quote from Henry Cloud and John Townsend is to rescue people from the natural consequences of their behavior is to render them powerless. And what's happened is because of the dangerous drugs that are on our streets right now, that fentanyl is so dangerous. It's 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine. They're mixing it, they're compounding it, it's not pure. It's got all kinds of the kitchen sink in it, and it's put into every other street drug out there. And
Mm-hmm.
so if anyone is using anything that they haven't picked up from the pharmacist, they're running a risk of an overdose. Well,
Yeah.
that is a very scary thing for a parent to say natural consequences could result in my child being dead.
Right.
But mom, let me just explain something to you. Giving them the keys to the car and taking them to get their driver's license could also result in that.
Yeah.
We do have hope. We are praying moms. We have the Holy Spirit leading us and guiding us and showing us when we should go. And that's what I had to learn, not to operate out of this flight or fight or fear, freezing instinct that had been so trained into me through this situation, and to operate out of fear, but to stop like you would if the house, like if you're on fire, stop, drop, and roll.
Mm-hmm.
Our drop is stop, pray, and then act. And so, God, is this truly an emergency? Can I have a boundary here? Are you telling me to take action? Are you telling me to just step back and pray and trust you? So
Mm.
my book
Good.
really is about faith and using and faith in our battle against addiction. There's a lot of good books out there that parents have rely on that talk more about the science and the medical side of things. For me, that I got that knowledge and I learned from that, but I went to the Bible and I found out that God has so much to say about it, and that he hasn't gone radio silent on addiction or wayward
Mm-hmm.
children or our prodigals who are acting rebelliously and doing dangerous life destructive behaviors, and I don't even mean
Mm-hmm.
like recklessly driving a motorcycle at 100 miles an hour without a helmet. We know that there's just behaviors. If they're being sexually promiscuous and they're
Yeah.
sleeping around and they are exposing themselves to who knows what, there's things like that can really decline a person quickly and really put them in dangerous situations. So for any parent, even if their child isn't dealing with this, they could be dealing with an addiction to pornography. They could be dealing with an addiction to gambling like my husband was. These things are all very life destructive.
Mm-hmm.
And so either way, we know that God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, reaches into those situations and he is speaking to their heart. And that's why we want to continue to pray. And so our boundaries will often feel very uncomfortable and they'll feel very unfair as if they were to read the book. What they learn is that God has boundaries. He's always had boundaries. His boundaries are not to protect himself. They're not, he draws a line between good and evil, between holiness and sin. And he also will only let us stray so far. Some seem to go farther than others. And then there's the consequences that go with it that God says, well, these are just like the law of gravity. If you jump off a roof, you're going to break your leg. Certain behaviors are going to have certain consequences, but nothing's going to take you too far from my love. And so boundaries to me are definitely should be implemented more with the whole family and the whole, like looking at everybody. Are there other people living in the house? Can you not allow your child to live there because they could be bringing dangerous friends and dangerous drugs around? If you know that you give them money and that money's going to be used for drugs, those are just very practical boundaries, but it's not going to feel good to sit on them.
Yeah.
So I encourage the moms, allow yourself to feel uncomfortable. And that's where good support comes into other people who've gone through this that can say, that's normal. He's going to create panic. He's going to create an emergency that you have to respond to right now by sending him some money or whatever, but it's okay to be uncomfortable and say no. And so that's how I talk about boundaries in the book.
I think that is great advice and kind of leads me into the next question that I have for us. We're coming to a close today. For that woman who's listening today and she's like, yes, to everything that you've said, she's right where you've been. For that mama whose heart is just absolutely shattered by this addiction and she's hanging on by a thread, how can you give her hope? What's that one thing that you could say to her today to give her a little hope?
Well, my hope is in the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. The same spirit, the same power that raised Christ from the dead is at work in us. And the beauty of it all is I encourage moms, pray for your children's salvation before you pray for their sobriety. And we often do it the other way around because Jesus is in the sanctification business. He knows what we need, when we need it, what we have to go through to get to that place of absolute surrender. So pray for their salvation because this life is temporary. It's temporary for all of us. No, we don't want our children living lives that are self-destructive. We want them to be happy, healthy, and whole. I wouldn't wish addiction on my worst enemy. But what happened was when I did exactly what Jesus says, keep your eyes on me, when I shifted it off of the problem and shifted it off of my need to fix the problem, because think about it, I wanted to fix the problem to save my child, but I also want relief from my own pain.
Right.
I didn't want to be hurting like this all the time. I didn't want to be grieving constantly. I didn't want to be always afraid and scared of that next phone call and all of that. Those things are still not easy. Grief is still very much a part of my life. Anxiety, that happens. I get a door knock. I get nervous, but I've learned to implement faith, to stop and pray and say, Jesus, what's going on here? Because no matter what it is, I praise you because you're with me and you're going to help me get through this. And you hear my prayers. You hear my cry for my child. And my prayers are not returning void. I know you are working and I am thankful that you're working in this situation. Right. But I would definitely reassure any mom who's out there and living in that kind of fear right now that I have seen the faithful hand of God carry these heartbroken mamas through the most difficult thing they could ever go through in their life, and for them to feel tremendously wrapped in his love and heartbroken, but so overwhelmed by the love of God. And so that's my encouragement to you, is that this is not something that he's on the sidelines watching. He loves us. He's brokenhearted for our children too. And he's actively working in their lives. And he wants us to lean on him, because what better way for us to be an example to our children than for them to see our faith and our trust in God through this process.
Well, amen. That is great advice. Thank you for sharing. Well, Dawn, as we are coming to a close today, I would love it if you could just take a minute, let the listeners and those who are watching know how they might be able to get in contact with you, perhaps for some coaching, maybe learn more about the Faith to Flourish ministry you have, and most importantly, how can they get copies of your books? And could you please once again tell us the titles of your books?
Okay, well, thank you so much. The Faith to Flourish ministry is pretty much on all social media. If they look at the Faith to Flourish, they'll find me. If they look up Dawn R. Ward, I had to put an R in there because the housewife in Cheshire in England has Dawn Ward as her URL. So I'm Dawn R. Ward. And so they can look me up either way. And the book, of course, is From Guilt to Grace, Hope and Healing for Christian Moms of Addicted Children. I also co-authored a few years back a book that's a workbook, and it's called Still Standing After All the Tears, Faith in the Battle. And that is one that Faith in the Battle edition. And that's when I co-authored with a friend, kind of teaching us teaching women what we went through, the steps that we went through to kind of, for both of us to get through and to come out the other side and to be able to have our heads on straight through this journey. Not that they're always on straight, but the tools that we use to kind of work that way that we found that worked for us. So that's available on Amazon as well. And then I just collaborated on 2 other books. One called Life Changing Stories, Butterfly Living Life Changing Stories, there was 30 plus authors in there. That was a really fun book to work on, and that can be found on Amazon as well. And one called Shepherd on Duty. And those are both devotionals. And so I've had fun. I love to collaborate. If anybody ever wants to collaborate on something like a devotional, it's just so fun because you meet so many amazing creatives and writers in the process, and also hear everyone's stories. And the coolest thing is that while we all have different stories, we're all so much alike.
True.
It's so true. And so, yeah, just reach out to me that way. And you can find me at thefaithtoflourish.com or dawnrward.com. will both lead you to my webpage, and it has all the information there.
Thank you for hanging out with me here on the Juggling Life Finding Balance podcast. I hope our time together leaves you feeling encouraged and inspired. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would love it if you would click that subscribe button wherever you are listening or watching, and then share it with a friend. And please come visit me on my website, viviancummins.com, where you'll find more great information and resources about how you can move that needle from busy to balanced. Until next time, stay blessed and be balanced.